Today, I'm going to tell you about a case with one of the most unexpected twists I've ever come across. A reversal so shocking, it stunned all of South Korea. Suncheon is considered one of the most beautiful places on the Korean peninsula, a city wrapped around a shallow coastal bay where vast reed fields stretch all the way to the horizon. Farther inland, ancient villages still preserve their traditional thatched roof homes, with earthenware jars of fermented sauces sitting in the courtyards. The Jeolla region is also regarded as the culinary heartland of the country. And yet, ironically, today's story begins with one of the most ordinary things you could find on a dining table here: a bottle of rice wine. That drink was Makgeolli, a traditional Korean rice wine with a cloudy white appearance, an alcohol content of only about 6 to 8%, and a mildly tart flavor balanced by a gentle sweetness. It's one of the cheapest and most common alcoholic drinks in Korea, the kind farmers would take out into the fields and pour into plastic bowls to share during a break from work. And precisely because it was so ordinary, no one would ever think to be suspicious of a bottle of Makgeolli. Now, let's turn back the clock to July 6th, 2009. It was a Monday. The place was Yongnim village in Wangjeonmyeon, on the northern outskirts of Suncheon. A small village tucked between low hills, sparsely populated and home mostly to older residents, because nearly all of the younger generation had already left for the cities in search of work and a new life. That morning, in a field within Wangjeon, more than 30 women were hard at work, sharp sickles in their hands as they quickly cut back the weeds creeping along the edges of the fields. But these weren't farmers tending their own land. They were participants in a government-run public employment program for low-income households. The government paid them to clear weeds, sweep roads, or maintain public greenery so they could earn a little extra income. Most of the workers were already elderly. Some were even in their 70s. Yet they still went out to work, day after day. At around 9:10 that morning, 4 women working on the western side of the field stopped and sat down to rest for a moment. Among them was 59-year-old Choi Myung-suk. She reached into her bag, pulled out a bottle of Makgeolli she'd brought from home, and offered it to the other 3 women to help ease their fatigue. Naturally, no one refused. In the middle of a morning's labor under the early July sun, there was hardly anything more refreshing than a cool sip of rice wine. The 4 women began taking sips together. Just 2 minutes later, one after another, all 4 collapsed right there beside the field. Mrs. Choi showed the most severe symptoms. She became dizzy, began vomiting violently, and quickly lost consciousness. The other 3 collapsed as well. One went into convulsions. Another struggled to breathe. Another could no longer speak. Workers on the far side of the field heard something unusual and looked up. When they saw 4 figures lying motionless among the freshly cut grass, they dropped their sickles and rushed over. The scene in front of them sent everyone into a panic. Some shouted for help, others ran to call for a vehicle, and all 4 victims were rushed for emergency medical treatment. Tragically, every effort came too late. Choi Myung-suk died on the way to the hospital, and another woman, 68-year-old Mrs. Jong, also did not survive. The remaining 2 lived, 74-year-old Mrs. Jang and 72-year-old Mrs. Lee. The reason they survived was actually very simple. The moment they swallowed the rice wine, both felt an unusually intense burning sensation in their throats and managed to vomit it all back up. Later, after they'd recovered enough to describe what happened, the survivors both remembered the same disturbing detail. The liquid in the bottle that day didn't look like ordinary Makgeolli. Rice wine is normally cloudy white, but what had been poured from that bottle was dark, almost black. One of the women recalled that when she first saw the strange color, she actually assumed it must be some kind of premium liquor she'd never tried before, and even remarked that it looked expensive. And according to their recollections, Choi Myung-suk herself, the woman who had brought the bottle, took her first sip and immediately said that something about the drink seemed strange. Moments later, she collapsed. Police quickly seized what remained of the liquor in the bottle and sent it for forensic testing. When the results came back, they sent a chill through everyone involved. The Makgeolli contained cyanide, In its potassium salt form, cyanide appears as small white crystals that, at a glance, look no different from sugar or table salt, and it's precisely that harmless appearance that makes it so terrifying. Once inside the body, cyanide prevents cells from using oxygen. The blood may still be carrying oxygen, the heart may still be beating, yet the cells themselves are effectively suffocating. Even a very small amount can kill a person within minutes. But what caught the police's attention most wasn't simply the presence of poison, it was the amount. The concentration of cyanide in that bottle was far beyond what would have been needed to kill a single person. That meant this couldn't have been a case of someone accidentally spilling some into the drink, and it certainly couldn't have been a mistake during production. Whoever poisoned the bottle had poured in a large amount deliberately, decisively, with one clear intention. Investigators then examined the bottle itself. If the killer had used a syringe to inject the poison through the cap or the side of the bottle, there should have been a tiny puncture mark. But no such trace was found. The poison had been poured directly through the mouth of the bottle after the cap was twisted open, and then the cap had been screwed back on. At that point, every possibility of an accident was ruled out. Police officially determined that this was a deliberate poisoning. So where had the bottle come from? What seemed like the simplest question of all was exactly where the case began to become deeply confusing. Police widened the investigation and checked more than 200 households in the area. That was when they discovered an important detail. The bottle of Makgeolli had indeed been brought to the field by Choi Myung-suk. But she hadn't bought it. She'd found it sitting right in her own yard. Her husband, Baek Jom-seon, told police that early that morning, when he got up and was preparing to leave for work, he noticed a black plastic bag sitting near the flower bed in the yard. Inside was Makgeolli. He had no idea when it had appeared, because when the family went to bed the night before, there had been nothing there. Mr. Baek didn't think anything of it. In rural South Korea, neighbors leaving a small gift outside someone's home was perfectly ordinary. His family was also known for helping people around the village. If someone needed something transported or needed help cleaning up, he was always willing to lend a hand. So to him, a few bottles of liquor left in the yard seemed like nothing more than an anonymous gesture of thanks from someone nearby. He carried the liquor inside, left it on the porch, said a few words to his wife, and went off to work. That day, Mrs. Choi was scheduled to take part in the public employment program with other women from the neighborhood, so she took the bottle with her, thinking she'd share it with everyone during their break. It would be the final decision of her life. By now, you can probably understand why the case reached a dead end almost from the very beginning. At the time, Yeongnam Village and the narrow roads surrounding it had no surveillance cameras, so there was no footage showing who had entered or left the village that night. Police also failed to recover any useful fingerprints or biological evidence from either the bottle or the plastic bag. To make matters even more difficult, when investigators traced the origin of the liquor, they discovered that this particular brand of Makgeolli was distributed only in certain parts of Suncheon, and Hwangjeonmyeon, where the poisoning took place, was not one of them. In other words, the bottle had been brought in from somewhere else. But the distribution network for rice wine in rural South Korea at the time was highly fragmented. Bottles passed through many hands, records were incomplete, and tracing exactly who had bought that particular bottle, where it had been purchased, and when it had been bought was almost impossible. Meanwhile, in Yeongnam Village, the funeral was held under a weight of grief, unlike anything the community had experienced before. At his wife's funeral, Baek Jom-seon couldn't contain his anguish and broke down sobbing in front of relatives and neighbors. The couple had been married for 33 years and had raised 4 children together, 1 son and 3 daughters. Their older children had already grown up and started families of their own. Only their youngest daughter, then 25 years old, was still living with her parents in the old family home. Mr. Baek himself had grown up in extreme poverty. As a young man, he had worked as a live-in servant and laborer, moving from one household to another within that very village. The house and the small piece of farmland his family eventually owned were the result of an entire lifetime spent working the soil. To their neighbors, they were a quiet, decent family who had never been known to have serious disputes with anyone. No one could understand why such a disaster had fallen upon a household like theirs, and no one could answer the biggest question of all. Who, in the middle of the night, had placed a black plastic bag beside Choi Myung-suk's flower bed, containing liquor heavily laced with cyanide? Who was the intended victim? Was the poison meant specifically for Mrs. Choi? Was it meant to kill the entire family? Or was the killer willing to let anyone unlucky enough to drink from that bottle die? For the next several weeks, Suncheon police made almost no progress. The case seemed to freeze in place, until something that appeared completely unrelated happened. The turning point came at 2 p.m. on July 26, 2009, exactly 20 days later. That afternoon, Choi Myung-suk's youngest daughter, Baek Young-ju, went to the local police station. But she wasn't there to ask about the investigation into her mother's death. She had come to report that a male neighbor had sexually assaulted her a total of 6 times over roughly the previous 6 months. The man was summoned for questioning, but from the very beginning he denied every allegation and maintained the same position through repeated interviews. Eventually, the case file was forwarded to prosecutors. At the request of the prosecutor handling the case, a face-to-face confrontation was arranged between the two sides, and it was there that an unexpected inconsistency emerged. The man's legs had once been severely injured, leaving them covered in prominent scars that anyone in close physical proximity would have been almost certain to notice. Yet Baek Young-ju appeared to know nothing about them. And when she was asked to describe specific details from any of the 6 assaults she had reported, she was unable to do so. The prosecutor immediately changed direction. Instead of continuing to question the man, he turned his attention to Baek Young-ju herself and began pressing her on the possibility that she had made a false accusation. Under that pressure, her demeanor changed quickly. At first, she'd spoken with complete certainty. Then she became increasingly hesitant, until finally, she fell completely silent. That silence hung over the interrogation room for a long moment. Then, without warning, she spoke. She admitted that the accusations she'd made were not true. And immediately afterward, she added one more sentence that left everyone in the room stunned. She was the one who had put the poison into the bottle of Makgeolli. She was the one who had killed her mother, and the others. No one could have imagined that what seemed like a separate accusation would uncover a clue in the poisoning case. In a matter of seconds, Baek Young-ju's position changed completely. She went from being a relative of one of the victims to becoming a suspect in the very same case. And at 9 o'clock that evening, investigators began questioning her about the poisoned rice wine. According to her first statement, the crime had been planned in advance. She said that on June 30th, she used a computer at a library to search for information about someone who sold poison. The next day, she made contact from a public payphone, and the two sides agreed on the purchase of 2 spoonfuls of poison for 100,000 won. The following day, she met the seller in person and handed over cash withdrawn with her bank card in exchange for a packet of poison wrapped in newspaper. Then, on July 4th, she bought the Makgeolli at a restaurant. And in the early hours of the morning on the day of the killings, at 3 a.m., she secretly carried the poison bottle outside and placed it beside the flower bed in her family's yard. The timeline in her statement was complete, detailed, and logically ordered. Prosecutors therefore considered it highly credible and placed her under emergency arrest in accordance with the law. A case that had remained frozen for 20 days suddenly seemed to have been solved by the killer's own confession. But the deeper investigators went, the more tangled everything became. During the second interrogation, Baek Young-ju retracted part of her own statement. This time, she said the first phone call hadn't been successful, and that only on the second attempt had the seller given her another number. She also said the money hadn't been withdrawn from a bank at all, but had come from somewhere else. Even the price of the Makgeolli was changed to an amount far lower than what she'd originally claimed. By the third interrogation, her statement changed the entire direction of the case. She said she'd still been hiding something. The person who had actually gone out to buy the poison and the liquor was not her, but her father, Baek Jum-seon. She said it was her father who had promised to prepare the tools for the crime and then ordered her to kill her mother. That reversal immediately raised a new question. If Mr. Baek wanted his wife dead, why would he involve his own daughter and effectively double the risk of being discovered? When asked about that, Baek Young-ju simply said that she didn't know. Prosecutors went back and re-examined the father's earlier statement and concluded that there were things about his behavior that seemed unusual. After all, he had handed his wife a bottle of liquor of unknown origin that he'd found sitting in the yard, without showing any concern at all. Meanwhile, as the interrogation of his daughter dragged on, she became more and more hesitant. Her anxiety was clearly visible in her body language, from unconsciously scratching her face to reaching out and moving objects around on the table. Finally, the prosecutor asked what amounted to a concluding question. Was it true that the killers were her and her father? Faced with that question, she answered yes. Based on that statement, prosecutors formally arrested Baek Jum-seon on August 26th. At first, he firmly denied the accusation, but when he was told that his daughter had confessed and had implicated him as well, he sat in silence for a long time. Eventually, he lowered his head and admitted to the poisoning. 2 months after the poisoning, South Korean prosecutors held a public press conference announcing that the perpetrators had been caught. The identities of the alleged killers stunned the entire country because they weren't strangers at all. They were the victim's own husband and youngest daughter. The motive announced afterward was even more shocking. According to the accusation at the time, Baek Jum-seon and his daughter had maintained an incestuous relationship for 15 years. After Choi Myung-suk discovered the relationship, the two allegedly feared that the scandal would be exposed and bring disgrace upon the entire family. Prosecutors said they therefore joined together to kill her, only to end up harming other innocent people as well. At the press conference, prosecutors laid out the entire sequence of events as they believed the investigation had established it. According to their account, at 6 p.m. on July 2nd, after finishing work at a construction site, Baek Jum-seon drove his wife to a noodle restaurant for dinner. There, he bought 3 25.4 fluid-ounce bottles of Makgeolli to take home. The family drank 1 bottle with the meal, while the other 2 were stored in the refrigerator. At 6 p.m. the following day, he took those 2 bottles out and went into a storage room to retrieve cyanide he'd purchased from a woman 17 years earlier, a substance he had originally intended to use for growing cucumbers. He placed everything on the floor of the storage room and revealed the murder plan to his daughter. At around 8 p.m. on July 4th, Baek Young-ju carried the items up onto the roof. Under the dim glow of a streetlight, she used a disposable plastic spoon to pour the poison into the bottle, then returned it to the refrigerator. At 3 a.m. on July 6th, while her mother was fast asleep, she wrapped the bottle in a plastic bag and secretly placed it beside the flower bed in the yard. Her father then carefully timed his part, waiting until around 6 a.m. before going outside, pretending to have found the bag by chance and handing it to his wife. The results of the investigation immediately triggered a wave of intense public outrage. In a small community like Hwangjeonmyeon, where nearly everyone knew one another, it took only a few days before the entire area seemed to be talking about nothing else. The names of Baek Jum-seon and his daughter were spoken with disgust. In the public mind, the entire case had been reduced to just 2 words: incest and murder. In the middle of that storm, Baek Jum-seon's 3 other children remained doubtful. They said that although they had already moved out, it hadn't been long since they'd left the family home. During the years when they had all lived together, the family members were rarely apart. If their father and younger sister had truly been involved in a relationship lasting as long as 15 years, they argued, there was no way the rest of them could have known absolutely nothing about it. But against the overwhelming anger of the public, those voices were too small, and they were quickly drowned out. The case went to trial at the Suncheon branch of the Gwangju District Court, where the 2 defendants faced murder charges along with several other offenses. Prosecutors sought the death penalty for the father and life imprisonment for the daughter. On February 18, 2010, the trial court delivered its verdict, and the decision surprised many people. The court found that the confessions raised serious questions about objective plausibility, had repeatedly changed over the course of interrogation, and contained multiple contradictions with the circumstantial evidence. Taken together, the court concluded that the statements lacked sufficient credibility. Baek Jeom-seon was therefore acquitted of all charges, while Baek Yong-ju was also acquitted of the murder charges and convicted only of making a false accusation. She received an 8-month prison sentence, suspended for 2 years. The ruling sparked fierce debate. Some saw it as the proper outcome of justice, while many others reacted with anger and disbelief. Prosecutors, however, remained firmly opposed to the decision. Just 5 days after the verdict, they filed an appeal. In 2011, the appellate trial opened at the Gwangju High Court, and it became the turning point that would send the father and daughter's fate in an entirely different direction. To address the weaknesses exposed at the first trial, prosecutors introduced additional arguments. After further questioning of the noodle shop owner, they said that under certain circumstances the restaurant did make transactions that were never entered into the records. They also submitted a video recording of Baek Jeom-seon confessing. In the footage, he admitted his guilt and said that he had told his daughter everything, adding that he could no longer endure the burden and had therefore decided to confess. The appellate court accepted those arguments. It ruled that although the father and daughter had changed their statements several times, the core elements remained consistent throughout. The type of poison, the type of alcohol, how it had been stored, and the alleged motive. The vague or shifting details about purchasing the Makgeolli and adding the poison, the court concluded, could be explained by failures of memory, and were not enough to invalidate the confessions as a whole. The judges described the case as a brutal and carefully planned murder, made even more serious by the fact that the poisoning had also taken the lives of innocent people. In the court's view, the crime was extraordinarily grave and could not be tolerated. On November 10, 2011, the appellate court overturned the entire trial court ruling and found both father and daughter guilty of murder. Baek Jeom-seon was sentenced to life in prison. In Baek Yong-ju's case, the court found that she had endured prolonged abuse by her own father and therefore reduced her punishment, sentencing her to 20 years in prison. From having been acquitted, the two were suddenly facing the harshest sentences of the case, a reversal that stunned many people. They continued to appeal, but after a series of legal proceedings, the Supreme Court of South Korea rejected their appeal on March 15, 2012, leaving the appellate judgment intact. Baek Jeom-seon was sent to Suncheon Prison to serve his life sentence, while Baek Yong-ju was transferred to Cheongju Women's Prison. The iron doors closed behind them. The media moved on to other stories. Yeongnim Village slowly returned to its old rhythm of life. From then on, the Suncheon Cyanide Makgeolli case was remembered mainly as a horrifying example of the collapse of family morality. The case was over. And for many years afterward, almost everyone was convinced that it truly was over. Before I continue, I want to tell you about a principle in South Korea's justice system, something that is considered part of a prosecutor's duty. According to a ruling by the country's Supreme Court, if prosecutors discover any evidence during an investigation that could benefit the very person they are prosecuting, they are required to submit that evidence to the court. At first, that may sound counterintuitive, but it's one of the pillars holding up the entire justice system. Judges don't conduct their own investigations. They make decisions based on what is placed before them. If the side presenting the case places only half of the evidence on the table, then no matter how properly the procedure is followed, the judgment is still being built on sand. Now let's go back and examine the original indictment, beginning with the bottle itself. Prosecutors insisted that Baek Jeom-seon had purchased 3 small bottles of Makgeolli from a noodle restaurant in Suncheon. But when the case reached court, the restaurant owner contradicted that claim. She said her business had never stocked bottles of that size. The restaurant sold only 30.4 fluid-ounce bottles, while the bottle recovered at the scene held 25.4 fluid ounces. The sales records from that exact day also supported what she said. At the appellate trial, prosecutors added the argument that when the restaurant ran out of its regular stock, it would sometimes sell smaller bottles without recording the sale. But that was presented only as a possibility raised through questioning, not as a fact that had actually been proven. But even if we assume the restaurant did sell bottles of that size, another problem remains. The drive from the village to the market district in the city was fairly long, taking about 40 minutes each way. If that trip really happened, then the vehicle should have appeared somewhere along the route. Police reviewed traffic camera footage covering the entire journey, but the car was never recorded anywhere. Even toll road data showed that his vehicle hadn't passed through. When challenged on this point, prosecutors argued that heavy rain that day had obstructed the camera's view. But the defense presented official weather data from that same date, showing that there had been no rain at all in the Hwangjeonmyeon area. That information was never submitted to the court. And where did the cyanide supposedly come from? The indictment said Bayek had purchased it from a woman. At first, his statement placed the purchase 4 or 5 years before the poisoning, but investigators later confirmed that the woman had died in 1999, years before even that timeline. So the date was changed to 17 years earlier. As for the physical evidence, the actual poison itself was never found. The entire basis for this part of the prosecution's case rested on the words of the accused himself. The answer offered in the indictment pointed to Bayek's cucumber field. Prosecutors argued that he had once grown cucumbers in a greenhouse, and that cucumber farmers in the area commonly mixed cyanide with water and poured it into the soil to kill pests, making it highly likely that he had kept some on hand. That argument came from a local resident who initially said she had seen such a substance being used. But that same woman later corrected her statement, saying she had remembered it incorrectly. What local farmers actually used was sulfur powder, not cyanide. When investigators questioned people more broadly, more than 50 residents from the area gave the same answer. No one in the local cucumber-growing community had ever used cyanide, nor was there any need to use it. Yet the file submitted to the court contained only the resident's original mistaken statement. Her correction, along with dozens of other statements denying the use of cyanide, was never submitted. During the crime scene reenactment, one very short question was asked. Baek Young-ju was asked what had happened to the plastic spoon she supposedly used to scoop the poison. She answered that she had thrown it into a trash bag, and the prosecutor replied that, in that case, it probably could no longer be found. But the truth was that the spoons hadn't disappeared at all. Investigators had seized 2 plastic spoons from the storage room at Baek's home and sent them for forensic testing. On September 10th, 2009, the results came back. No cyanide was detected on either one. That result was also never submitted to the court. But the piece of evidence that threatened to bring down the entire indictment was simpler than all the rest. A clock. Remember the time stated in the prosecution's version of events, 8 p.m. on July 4th. Bank records showed that between 7:55 and 8:48 that evening, Baek Young-ju called the bank's automated service 9 times to check whether a payment had arrived in her account. And there was more. Security footage from the Suncheon bus terminal captured her there at around 8:30 p.m., even though the trip from her home to the terminal took about an hour. At the exact time, prosecutors said she was standing on the roof pouring poison into a bottle. She was actually on a bus, leaving the city. When this contradiction emerged, rather than reconsidering the entire scenario, prosecutors simply moved the alleged time of the poisoning half an hour earlier. There is one more detail I want you to keep in mind. Baek Young-ju had an IQ of around 74, placing her in the borderline intellectual functioning range. She could manage ordinary daily life, but under intense pressure, she was easily overwhelmed. Combined with her low self-confidence and tendency to please the person in front of her, she was prone to agreeing with others, and even admitting to things that had never happened. Her father, meanwhile, had dropped out of school at the elementary level, was almost unable to read or write, and could do little more than write his own name. And yet the case file contained a long, coherent handwritten statement, supposedly written by him, filled with legal terminology. The handwriting stiff and faint, as though it had been copied from another document. The person who uncovered all of this was attorney Park Jun-young, a name well known in South Korea for his work on retrial cases and for helping clear the names of people who had been wrongfully convicted. He first heard about the case in 2018 when a friend casually mentioned that the young woman appeared to be innocent. But it wasn't until 2021 that he began looking into it seriously. He went to the Suncheon prosecutor's office and requested copies of the original case files. What he brought back amounted to roughly 4,000 pages of documents, a large portion of which had never been presented in court. A petition for retrial was filed. During the preliminary hearings, video recordings of the original interrogations were played in the courtroom. On the screen, Baek Young-ju was asked to describe the appearance of the poison she was accused of personally pouring into the bottle. She couldn't describe it. An investigator then read the answer to her, and she simply repeated, "Yes," again and again and again. Attorney Park emphasized before the court that investigators had built the case file by driving a wedge between the father and daughter. On January 4th, 2024, the Gwangju High Court ruled that the case would be reopened. Enforcement of the sentences was suspended under the principle of the presumption of innocence, and 15 years after their arrests, Baek Jum-seon walked out of Suncheon prison, while Baek Young-ju was released from Cheongju Women's Prison. Prosecutors strongly opposed the decision, but by the end of that year, their request to overturn the retrial order had been rejected. This retrial was not about determining who the real killer was. It was about putting the original investigation itself on trial, whether it had been conducted lawfully, and whether the evidence used to convict the two defendants could still be considered valid. On October 28, 2025, the court delivered its ruling. The judges found that Baek Young-ju was a person with borderline intellectual functioning, yet throughout her interrogation, she had not been informed of her right to remain silent. No trusted person had been present with her, and investigators had repeatedly asked leading questions based on a predetermined narrative, despite having no objective evidence to support it. As a result, the court ruled that all statements obtained through that process had no evidentiary value. As for her father, the court found that he could read only very simple words, yet there was nothing in the case file proving that the written interrogation records had ever been read back to him. That meant the court couldn't conclude that he had truly been given a chance to understand and explain the contents of the documents he signed. The judges also pointed to the fact that evidence favorable to the defendants had never been submitted. And when it came to the alleged motive, the claim that had fueled public outrage for 16 years, the court reached a stark conclusion. There was not a single piece of objective evidence to support it. Baek Jum-seon and Baek Young-ju were found not guilty. The only conviction that remained was Young-ju's 8-month suspended sentence for making a false accusation, which had been handed down at the first trial. On November 4th, 2025, South Korea's Supreme Prosecutor's Office announced that it would accept the ruling and waive its right to appeal. It also issued an apology, and the acquittals officially became final. Walking out of the courthouse in Gwangju that day were a 75-year-old man and a 41-year-old woman. People who had themselves been cleared in other wrongful conviction cases came carrying flowers for them. Baek Jum-seon's eyes were red, his voice hoarse. He said that what had happened all those years ago still left him unable to find the words, and that when he had asked to confront the accusations against him, what he received instead was a slap across the face. His daughter said that even thinking back on that period made her shudder, and that what she wanted to say to investigators was simple. An investigation must never be conducted that way. So who pays the price for everything that happened? Some of the conduct during the original investigation could potentially have amounted to offenses such as abuse of authority or falsifying official documents. But the statute of limitations for those offenses was only 7 years, and that time had long since expired, so no one was prosecuted. As for the prosecutor who had handled the case at the time, Kang Nam-seok, what happened later carried a certain irony. He later left the prosecution service under less than favorable circumstances and went into private legal practice. Then, in February 2018, in a completely unrelated case, he was indicted for accepting a total of roughly 100 million won from a client on 2 occasions, promising that he would use his influence with prosecutors. On April 7, 2019, the court sentenced him to 3 years in prison and ordered the forfeiture of 100 million won. He was released in 2022. Eventually, what had been hidden came to light, but it surfaced in another case, not this one. Meanwhile, the 2 people from Yeongnim village remained behind bars for years longer. The father and daughter are now going through the process of seeking compensation. But there are things money can never buy back. Baekjum Seon lost the wife he'd spent 33 years with. He also lost 15 of his later years behind bars, along with the home and the small plot of farmland he had built up from the days when he worked as a live-in servant. His daughter entered prison at just 25 years old and walked free when she was nearly 40, carrying for all those years 2 labels at once: the woman who killed her mother, and the central figure in a rumor that had never been true. But the story didn't end there. Once the father and daughter were cleared, the 2009 poisoning case went all the way back to the beginning. Once again, it became an unsolved murder with no identified killer. At the end of 2025, the Jeonnam Provincial Police Agency classified it as an unsolved case and assigned a special team to reinvestigate it from scratch. They retrieved the entire original case file and began reviewing everything to determine whether anything had been overlooked or distorted. In South Korea, the statute of limitations for murder has been abolished entirely, meaning that no matter how many years pass, the killer can still be brought to trial. And when investigators went back through the police files from 2009, they found that there had once been another name under suspicion. It belonged to a man in the village with the surname Do, someone who had been in conflict with Choi Myung-suk. About a year before the poisoning, another elderly woman who was also having a dispute with him had found a bottle of liquor outside her own home, darkened in color in almost exactly the same way. The difference was that she thought it looked strange and poured it away. On the very day of the killings, Mr. Doe called several people in the village, claiming that he wanted them to keep an eye on his house, and then asked one more question. Had anything unusual happened in the neighborhood? When police later questioned him, he insisted that he had never called anyone. Not long afterward, he moved away. Then prosecutors turned their attention toward the victim's own family, and that investigative lead ended there. Even now, however, the renewed investigation has made little progress. Police are trying to trace the path of the poisoned bottle, but most of the villagers who were witnesses at the time have since died, and the memories of those still alive have changed greatly from what they told investigators back then. Police say that what they need most now are the memories of the people who lived there. Just one person who remembers seeing an unfamiliar figure in the village during those early morning hours could provide the clue that changes everything, and so the Sunshin Cyanide Makgeolli case remains unfinished. After 16 years, the one thing that has finally been established is not who committed the murders, but who did not. 2 people lost 1/3 of their lives because they were poor, because one could barely read and the other had borderline intellectual functioning, making them the easiest people to fit into the empty space of a case investigators couldn't solve. And because that empty space was filled too quickly, whoever actually poured cyanide into that bottle of rice wine was given all those years to live freely, beyond the reach of the law. That night, someone quietly walked into a yard in Yeongnim village, placed a black plastic bag beside a flower bed, then turned and disappeared back into the darkness. To this day, no one knows who that person was. That brings today's video to an end. If you'd like to hear another case, I've left a few more waiting for you on the screen. Pick one, and I'll tell you the next story. Goodbye.